This summer, I've been reading a biography of Abigail Adams, wife of our second president, John Adams. One of the things that struck me as I read this biography is that Abigail was paying close attention to the revolution that was unfolding around her. I didn't know this until I read the book, but while John was in Philadelphia debating independence and helping imagine what the new nation might become, Abigail was home in Massachusetts, managing their farm, raising their children, worrying about disease and war, all at the same time writing letters to her husband in Philadelphia. In March of 1776, on the eve of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, she wrote one of her most famous letters. As John and the other delegates considered what laws might govern this new nation, Abigail urged him to remember the ladies. She understood that language being used to describe the American Revolution, words like liberty, freedom, rights, a government that cannot simply exercise power over people without giving them a voice. And Abigail seemed to have recognized something that many of the men declaring these principles had not fully reckoned with yet. If these things are true, then they should be true for women too. Now, John Adams did not immediately respond by rushing the Continental Congress and demanding equal rights for women. Not even close. But Abigail had named a contradiction. She listened carefully to what these men said they believed, and then she had the audacity to ask if they believed it enough to extend its implications to someone like her. And nearly 1,800 years earlier, another woman had the audacity to ask something remarkably similar. We don't know her name. Matthew simply calls her the Canaanite woman. She is a foreigner, an outsider, a woman who, according to every boundary that mattered in that time and place, had no particular reason to believe that a Jewish Messiah had come to her. But apparently, she had been paying attention. Because when Jesus enters the region of Tyre and Sidon, she comes shouting after him, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." She knows who Jesus is. She knows something about the mercy he has come to represent. And she believes, perhaps before the disciples themselves are ready to believe it, that if God's mercy really is as abundant as Jesus says it is, then surely there must be enough mercy for her daughter, too. Even if all she gets are the crumbs. This is precisely where the story gets uncomfortable, because Jesus does not respond in the way we've come to imagine he will. The Canaanite woman comes to Jesus desperate for help. Her daughter is suffering and she cries out to Jesus for mercy. And Matthew tells us that Jesus says nothing, not a word. She keeps crying out to him until eventually the disciples have had enough. "Send her away, Jesus, for she is annoying." There's something painfully familiar about this response. Here is a woman in desperate need, and the disciples are mostly concerned that she's making too much noise. She's disrupting things. She's making them uncomfortable. She will not go away quietly. And these people that are closest to Jesus, the people who have traveled with him, who have listened to him teach, who have watched him heal, who have just witnessed him feed 5,000 people with 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish, want Jesus to make her leave. And then the story becomes even more difficult. Because when Jesus finally speaks, he says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." In other words, my mission is to Israel, and you are not Israel. But even after that, she still doesn't leave. She comes closer, she kneels before him, and she says perhaps the simplest prayer anyone could pray: "Lord, help me." To which Jesus answers, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." There really isn't a comfortable way around that sentence. Sure, we can talk about the historical context. We can point out that the word Jesus uses could refer to a household dog instead of a wild dog. We can debate whether Jesus is testing her, testing the disciples, or doing something else entirely. And biblical scholars have been debating these questions for a very long time. But whatever explanation we choose, Matthew doesn't seem particularly interested in making this encounter comfortable for us. Instead, he says, there's a table, and there are children sitting at that table. And this woman has just been told that the food on the table belongs to someone else. This is particularly ironic because just 1 chapter earlier in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus literally fed thousands of people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And now, just a short time later, the disciples are standing in front of another person who is hungry and who is in need of God's mercy. And once again, they seem convinced that there isn't enough for her. But this woman sees something they don't. She hears Jesus talk about children and bread and dogs, and she doesn't argue about whether she deserves to be at the table. Instead, she says, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table, even the crumbs." She seems to understand something the disciples had forgotten. When the table belongs to Jesus, even the crumbs are enough. And maybe that's the image at the heart of this story. What is it that this woman sees that the disciples do not? Because Matthew has placed this encounter at a very particular point in his gospel. Just before Jesus arrives at Tyre and Sidon, he's been arguing with the Pharisees, the religious scholars of the day, with what makes someone clean or unclean. And then Jesus travels into Gentile territory, and a Canaanite woman appears. It's helpful to think of the Canaanites as the ancient enemies of Israel. These were the people that Israel had been fighting with for generations. Other outsiders. So Matthew has just given us a conversation about what makes someone clean or unclean. And Jesus has just told the disciples about what defiles a person doesn't come from the outside. And then almost immediately, Matthew introduces someone who has spent their whole life being regarded as an outsider. It's one thing to rethink a boundary in theory when you're arguing with the religious scholars of the day. It's another thing when someone from the other side of that boundary is standing right in front of you and asking for mercy. It is remarkable that the person who is supposedly on the outside seems to understand Jesus better than the people standing right beside them. The children can have their bread because the Canaanite woman believes that there will still be enough. And that leaves a question for the church. Where have we mistaken our boundaries for God's boundaries? Because churches are remarkably good at building tables. We build traditions around them. We develop customs around them. We learn where everyone sits and how everything is supposed to work. And then sometimes, without ever intending to, we begin to believe that since we have been sitting at the table for so long, that the table belongs to us. Friends, I've experienced this recently as Session and I have been thinking through what to do with the leftover day care inventory. We have a lot of stuff left over from this ministry, and we're trying to think, what does it mean to be good stewards of this stuff now that the ministry is taking a different form? There are lots of things we could do with this stuff, but one of the things that Session has been thinking through is how do we take this stuff and let it be a blessing to our community? That means that it has taken us longer to go through the stuff and distribute the stuff than we would like. It means meeting one-on-one with community leaders and hearing what they're doing in the community, and then thinking through what of our stuff can aid them in their ministries. It meant I think it was Thursday, helping this woman that works with Coriopolis Community Development load 10 boxes of baby wipes into her car so she could distribute them at the food pantry on Saturday. Friends, I gotta say, there's not really a playbook or a roadmap for how to do this work well. There is only praying and asking and trusting that the Spirit will show up and bless us and bless this community in the midst of it. Because just because one ministry is ending, that doesn't mean that God's work with us is done. And part of imagining what we will do in those spaces in the future is getting them cleared out so that future ministries can have a home. As I was doing that work this week and thinking through the story of the Canaanite woman, I was like, wait a minute, maybe I'm missing something here. Maybe what God wants to do in this space is bigger than what I can imagine. And how do I help steward these things to help make that ministry and this mission possible? It also reminded me of the story that we read last week, when a crowd gathered, hungry, and the disciples were like, oh my goodness, how in God's name are we ever going to feed this many people? And not only did God feed people, but there were 12 baskets of food left over. Because when God is at work, there is always more than enough. And now this woman stands before the same Jesus and somehow understands what the disciples and sometimes I forget. There is enough. There is enough mercy for people who have always had a seat at the table. There is enough mercy for people who have been pushed towards the edges. There is enough mercy for people who challenge what we thought we knew about the size and scope of the table. This woman looked at Jesus and somehow knew, if this really is the Son of God, if this really is the mercy of God standing before me, if God's grace really is as abundant as He says it is, then even the crumbs will be enough. And she was right. Thanks be to God. In Jesus' name.